Now, water has to be handled with great sensitivity. It is a substance which is alive. It has to be treated as something alive. Therefore, it should not be exposed to excess heat. It should not be exposed to excess pressure. All those things we know in our human body are destructive. And the same thing applies to water. As long as water is able to flow in vortices down a river, and to have a movement, a flowing sort of waltzing movement to left and right as it spirals around one bend in one way and one the other, then it's able to generate these cooling vortices. And this always, no matter what the external conditions, or at least to a certain extent, no matter what the external conditions, the water is able to cool itself towards its all-important state of temperaturelessness, which is 4 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, with many of the practices, hydraulic practices, river engineering practices, and so on, water is forced and confined to flow in straight channels, and these channels are really like a straitjacket on water. It stops its free movement. It's not able to move. It's not able to waltz from left to right. All its ability to generate these vortices is removed from it. And as a living substance, it becomes diseased. And when forced to move in or be conducted in such a way, then because it can't cool itself, it warms up. And the oxygen content becomes aggressive and fosters the development of parasitic life forms, bacteria and so on, because the water has become too warm. And its energy, like we have in our body, we have energies which enhance our immune system. When those become depleted, then we get sick. And the same thing happens to water. And the greatest and most sensitive care must be taken of water if it is to fulfill its functions, which is to support life. Because life without water is unthinkable. And one of the greatest fallacies in economic theory today is, or not fallacies, but sort of mistaken thinking, is that the world can continue to move, to grow in its materialistic way on the assumption that there can be no limit to quantitative growth. Of course there must be, because this planet is finite, and there's a finite number of artifacts or finite materials, raw materials. When rain falls onto the earth, the rain has a certain temperature. The earth, in order to absorb the rain, must have a cooler temperature. This is a positive temperature gradient, because we are going from a hotter to a cooler temperature through the ground. As long as the ground is cooler than the incident rain, the water will infiltrate, and that really happens under conditions of healthy forest or healthy vegetation, which cools the ground. That means the water is absorbed, and in forestry conditions, 85% of the water that falls will be absorbed by the ground and won't be released, for instance, till 2 or 3 days after, even if it's heavy rain. Now, if we have removed the trees, if the ground has been warmed up, then we have the existence of a negative temperature gradient from the atmosphere into the ground, in that the rain is cooler, but the receiving ground is warmer. And as a result, the water will not penetrate but run sideways. Like you put a drop of water on an electric hot plate, it skitters sideways and steams. And this steaming is the same thing that happens to the water, which has fallen on the ground under a negative temperature gradient. In that because it is not absorbed, much larger areas of water are exposed to the sun, and there's a much faster and abnormal rate of evaporation, which means that a very large amount of water is returned to the atmosphere far too quickly. And as a result of that, you have large agglomerations of water here, no water there, deluges here, drought there. And that is all because the water balance has been disrupted, by and large, by humankind's activities in forestry and agriculture and water resources management. And we are paying the price for that now, and there is only one solution, and that is to reforest as fast as possible, because then the water will be allowed to enter into the aquifer systems underground. A lot of carbon dioxide will be absorbed in the photosynthetic process. The climate will be cooled and the water balance regulated. And then we can expect to have after that more even and regular climatic patterns than we are experiencing today. And all this is due to the lack of understanding of temperature in relation to water movement and water behavior. There are certain relations between water quality and the human immunity. In the same way, there are relations between temperature and the immune qualities of water. Both blood and water fulfill the same function. They supply, on the one hand, the body earth with nutrients and elements so that it can grow and develop, and on the other hand, in our own body, it does the same thing. And these abilities are very much temperature dependent. But first we'll discuss water, because this also applies to the body. So anything really that I say about water also applies to blood, and it applies to sap and the movement of sap in trees. Water has its greatest density at its anomaly point of +4 degrees. It has to be maintained at this temperature for as long as possible, because this is a temperature which allows water to shift material. It allows water to grind up rocks, for instance, on its passage down a river, which then are supplied to the environment through which it passes. The coolness allows for the removal, transport of sediment, which is also which needs to happen in the blood, in the body, because the blood has to take waste matter and take it away. If the temperature relationships in the blood are not correct, then things like varicose veins and sclerosis and so on happen, because the blood isn't in a position energetically anymore to shift the material. The same applies to water. Now, water has, of course, its content of oxygen, and oxygen, as we all know, is always present at growth and also in decay. And whether it is active in one or the other spheres depends on the temperature. And in water, this crucial, what you might call changeover temperature, is at 9 degrees. Below that, the oxygen is, so to speak, bound by the water and is a passive. It's passive, and it goes towards the creating of high-grade microorganisms beneficial to life. Once water rises above that 9 degrees, then it gradually becomes more aggressive, and it enters an energetic level which is, so to speak, in harmony with parasites and bacteria, and then fosters their growth and development. And that is why it's very important in terms of the way we transport water and we move it from one place to another, that it should always be able to cool itself. It should be able to breathe, because as a living substance it must also be able to breathe. And in our modern world we seal it up in concrete or steel pipes, and gradually the water suffocates, and its oxygen content gets totally burnt up. Water has to be handled with great sensitivity. It is a substance which is alive. It has to be treated as something alive. Therefore, it should not be exposed to excess heat. It should not be exposed to excess pressure. All those things we know in our human body are destructive. And the same thing applies to water. There are two forces acting in any flow of water. That there is the force of gravity, which flows from the source down to the sea, and there's the force of levity, which flows from the sea back up to the source again. And the trout responds and is able to manipulate the forces of gravity and the forces of levity in order to maintain its station in flowing water. The extraordinary thing is that when a trout is startled from its lair or where it's reposing, then it accelerates upstream with